Thank you, Radwan. When I first started coming to Tunisia, the thing that struck me was that within the intelligentsia and the university community, I never met so many lawyers in my life. Experts on constitutional law, legal. Of course, the president himself claims to be an expert on constitutional law. It's a country that per capita has more, seemed to me, have more experts on issues of law and constitutional than I've ever seen in the region. So quite extraordinary. And of course, everything Said said and Abdul Razak is, I'm not going to repeat this sad story. It's kind of Kafkaesque when we know that the president says that any prosecutor who doesn't agree with the job he's supposed to undertake is, of course, against the state. I mean, that's a kind of neo-totalitarian frame of mind that is really projected by the president of Tunisia, and it's, of course, very dismaying. But I don't want to talk about sort of the record of the abuse of the subordination of the judiciary. In many respects, it's a very familiar story. When you have these sorts of populist autocrats who are trying to place themselves in power, the first order of business is to go after the judiciary and subordinate it to the executive. I mean, we see that we saw that in Hungary. We see this in Poland. We've seen this most recently in Israel. I mean, this is a very, and we saw that in Brazil. It's a very familiar. We see aspects of it even in the United States. I have to say, it's a very familiar pattern, and it's almost predictable. The difference, one of the main differences with the Tunisian cases, it's this subordination of the judiciary is usually accomplished through the, strangely enough, through a legislature, which is organized with the allies of the president, often through a rejiggering of the electoral rule, which gives the ruling party and the president the ability to transform the parliament into a vehicle that legitimates the subordination of the judiciary. This has not been the case in Tunisia. The president got rid of the parliament right away and has been operating and pursuing this whole project of trying to restructure the judiciary through his allies in the military and the security apparatus, chiefly, but also through the broader support of a kind of campaign of terrorism and intimidation that's taken place on Facebook and in ways that are really greatly magnify the president's efforts and given it a kind of strange reality that it actually has a kind of social base, but it's a kind of online social base, but it has really been used to intimidate opponents of this and to go after them and sort of essentially accuse them of crimes and on the social media. And this is something that has worked to the president's favor, which is very dismaying. But I also want to say that we have to sort of just take a step back and understand what it is about the broader situation in Tunisia that has helped to sort of facilitate the president's campaign. And I think the broader situation is massive disillusionment with the standing political elite and all the political parties, massive disillusionment with the previous parliament. In other words, a form of politics, form of democratic politics that over the years was increasingly removed from the everyday reality of Tunisians. And that is what helped get the president elected. He won by a substantial majority. And all the polls we see so far suggest, and the ones I see are very reliable, the president is the only political leader who has major political support. The most recent poll that I've seen, and again, it's very reliable, shows support for political parties at about 5%. There isn't a political leader among and with all due respect, Mr. Abdul Razak, there isn't a political leader that seems to have commanded much support among the wider political populace in these recent polls. And they can't the institution which undertook these polls has not yet published them, but once again, they seem very credible and scientific and so on. And the polls have been reaffirmed several times over the last few months before the escalation of the authoritarian onslaught from the president. And what they really tell us is that what the president is banking on is this degree of alienation and estrangement from the political elite and from the political institutions. And in that regard, he's a very rational player. He understands that he has some understanding of the of this context and how to use it to his favor. And I wouldn't, by the way, agree with the conclusion that there was a boycott of the parliamentary elections, which shows that there was a rejection of the president. I don't see that as, that's an understandable position for some people to take. I don't think it's substantiated. I think what happened is that people simply are not interested in these formal political institutions and see them as basically irrelevant in the effort to sort of, and of course, the president manipulated that point and tried to argue, well, they don't care about these institutions. That was a self-serving remark, but it wasn't untrue. You do not have in Tunisia the kind of massive political mobilization you have had in other countries going through so-called democratic backsliding that might give the ruling political elite the kind of leverage and power they need to stand up to the autocratizing agenda of the president. The protests that have thus far taken place in Tunis are far from demonstrating mass mobilization of the kind that you would expect to find if you're looking for the kind of movement that pushed the president back from the abyss. It's simply not there. And one reason it's not there is the continued disillusionment with a political experiment that really was increasingly seen as a kind of political theater based in Tunis, but not relevant to the lives of many Tunisians. And another reason why you don't see the kind of mass mobilization that you would want to have in order to give the political elite the leverage they need to negotiate with the regime, and that's what you're looking for, right, is that the UGT does not command the kind of mass political support. The polls that I've seen suggest that Taboubi has like 8% support. That's remarkable for that trade union. So it doesn't have the capacity for mass mobilization, and it has been playing its cards very shrewdly not to completely step away from the president, and which is a familiar sort of position for the trade union to take in order to protect its own interests. But that means that the organization, the one mass organization that has the ability to sort of engage and mobilize a large number of people in theory, right, 700,000 to 800,000 members, has thus far really not. I mean, they have. Taboubi has denounced the president and so on. There have been some protests, brief protests in a number of cities, but we don't see we see nothing that even is close to the kind of mass mobilization that would show that a large portion of the society is completely enraged with the president, is ready to go into the streets, and so we have a kind of situation where he can get away with it, whether we're talking about Ghannouchi or any other political leader, there's just the poll numbers are shocking. No, they're not shocking. In fact, they're quite predictable. And so I don't know. I'm trying to think beyond sort of the gloomy situation, Radwan, that you just described, because I'm also trying to think about everything I know as a political scientist who've studied these dynamics in other countries. It tells me that there are certain things you need in place that could provide some measure of leverage to push this kind of president that we have in Tunisia from desisting and respecting human rights and stopping his effort to subordinate the judiciary and put political leaders in prison. I mean, the whole thing is atrocious, but I don't see it. And until I see that evidence of that, I'm not sure exactly how the political project of the president will be stopped or reversed. And I have to be honest about that. And of course, the message from Washington, D.C., from the Biden administration, until only the last week or two, really has not been encouraging, right? I mean, it's, I think that quite the contrary. Earlier on in this process, we saw messages that sort of could be viewed by the president and his equipe, his team, as basically giving them not a green light, but suggesting the United States was not going to get in the way. The U.S. government wouldn't get in the way. And that too is, of course, and that has changed. We've seen it in the last few days, but maybe this is probably, this could be too late, too little, too late. And finally, I'll just add that one wild card, of course, as it's always said, is the economy, the IMF deal. It is very difficult to see how the IMF can sign an agreement for economic and market reforms without an independent judiciary that can provide a legal structure that will encourage foreign investment to see Tunisia as a viable market when foreign investors can go a lot of other places. So the notion that you can have market reforms without an independent judiciary is, of course, nonsense. But it could be that the president will try to sign the agreement anyway, because he will try to maximize whatever leverage he can get from that. And we don't know how the UGTT will respond if such an agreement is signed, because they've already denounced it and said they would oppose it. But of course, if they did, we could have a dynamic of a larger mass mobilization that might change the balance of power. But for now, we have a kind of we have a situation that is not working to the advantage of those who would like to stop this autocratization and compel the president and his people to restore some basic elements of democracy, rights, and so on. It's not obviously an encouraging situation. I hate to put it that grimly, but there it is.